Sales feed. Have you ever overpromised just to close a deal? Or has the client ever asked you to compromise on your vision? Change a detail here and there. Or were those changes you promised so large that suddenly it felt like your product wasn't even yours anymore? Salespeople everywhere are constantly being asked to conform to the world around them. So, let me ask you, are you in danger of losing what makes your product and your company special? Are you in danger of losing your sense of self? It's actually funny. In high school, my sense of self was being known as the tie guy. Yeah, I worked at a fabric store and enjoyed taking leftover scraps home to create colorful ties to wear to school. What can I say? The ties went really well with the briefcase I carried with me every single day. Sure, I got shoved into a locker on the second day of freshman year, but I stuck to my guns. I never let outside influences water down my own personal brand. And today, I want to share a story of another tie guy. But this tie designer managed to use his designs to change the face of fashion. I'm Andrew Davis, and this is how it all began. Ruben was standing inside a prominent New York City department store. Around him, fashionable clothing displays and racks of menswear stretched in all directions. For years, the young man had been trying to sell his line in this very store, and suddenly his time had come. The gentleman standing in front of him had just offered him his dream. Yes, I'll sell your designs. There are just a few changes you'll need to make. After hearing the man's request, Ruben took a moment to consider. Sure, he could make those changes and close the biggest deal of his life, but was that a smart decision for the long run? Ruben took a moment to consider the man's request, then turned on his heel and walked out of the store. Now, to understand the thoughts that were racing through the young man's head, let me take you back to his childhood. You see, as a child, Ruben had a lazy eye. He also had a lisp. Combine that with his difficult to pronounce last name, and well, let's just say he had it tough. He grew up in a poor neighborhood in the Bronx, the son of an immigrant family from Russia. And to pass the time, Ruben found himself spending hours simply sitting on marble stoops right outside his family home, watching the world pass him by. At school, Ruben was shy around the other kids. He was self-conscious of his speech impediment, and he did his best to avoid the bullies. The kids at recess loved to torment him, and to escape the stresses of life, Ruben found a safe haven at the local cinema. Now here, he'd sit amongst the quiet rows of chairs to watch his favorite actors on the silver screen. Cary Grant and Fred Astaire, Gary Cooper, and he'd imagine being dressed in their clothes, full of confidence and surrounded by luxury. Before too long, Ruben began to develop his own sense of style. In a time when everyone else was doing their best to conform, Ruben was doing his best to push the limits. If others were wearing white bucks, well, Ruben would slip on a pair of saddle shoes. If they were wearing crew neck sweaters, Ruben was sporting a V-neck. If they wore wool, he wore cashmere. His individuality, his sense of self, helped him grow his confidence year after year. And by his senior year, Ruben answered the yearbook question, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" with a simple word: a millionaire. Ruben was in his mid-20s when he was finally able to turn his passion for fashion into a career. This was when he earned a sales job with A. Rivets & Company, selling one of the fashion staples of the day, men's neckties. By now, you know that Ruben had ideas that were bold and groundbreaking. He constantly made suggestions, new styles, new ways of wearing the looks. His boss finally looked at him one day and declared, "The world is not ready for Ruben Lifshitz." As you can imagine, his declaration did little to dampen Ruben's spirits. No, his own sense of self and self-confidence was too strong. Instead, the young man continued to sell ties door to door for his employer. But Ruben, well, he sold his ties with style. He'd show up to sales meetings driving an old Morgan car while wearing an antique aviator jacket with goggles. His wardrobe ranged from expensive suits to eclectic bomber jackets. His clothes were so unusual that he began to attract attention.
Happy New Year, 1964.
It was the year 1964 when a hot fashion trade paper, the Daily News Record, ran an article on Ruben and described how he managed to wear clothes that were a season's jump ahead of the market. Everyone was talking about the hip young tie salesman with the $1 million style. Now, ties in the mid-1960s were very conservative. They were made of plain fabrics and had a narrow design, and Ruben wanted to be more adventurous. He recognized the world was becoming a bit more groovy. So, you guessed it, Ruben began to make and design his own line of ties. You've probably heard the phrase rags to riches. Well, Ruben began with literal rags. That's because he'd find scraps of fabric with bright and interesting patterns to use for his new ties. If an old couch had an interesting fabric, well, Ruben would simply grab his scissors and get to work. His line of ties were wider than the narrow style of the day and sold under Ruben's own personal brand. At night, Ruben, his mother, and his new wife would sit around the kitchen table sewing on his own personal label. Not only did his ties look different, they also cost 50% more than other brands, but they were worth it. Every other designer was selling ties. Ruben was selling a statement. Once again, the young designer began making his rounds through the stores in New York City, and slowly he began to make some sales. But his business was far from successful. He was still missing that big break, that one particular store in New York City that catered to the exact type of customer he wanted to reach. It was a store that was hip, young, and exciting. Its many floors carried a sense of romance that was perfect for his designs. That store was Bloomingdale's. So, let's return to that fateful day when the man in charge of styling ties at Bloomingdale's gave Ruben the news he'd been waiting to hear. Bloomingdale's wanted to sell his designs. There was just one problem. They wanted him to make the style narrower and replace his label with theirs. In essence, they wanted to take away Ruben's personal stamp, take away what made his ties uniquely special. So, despite the fact that Ruben had been dying to sell from Bloomingdale's, despite his commitment to growing the brand, and despite the feeling that his legs were about to crumple from beneath him, Ruben said no and walked out. Why did Ruben say no to such a huge opportunity? How was his business going to recover? And how did Ruben live out his childhood dream of appearing on the silver screen? We'll find out after this word from Sales Feed. I'm Andrew Davis, and like you, I know that sales is a tough gig. It's competitive, mentally exhausting, and what works today might not work tomorrow. That's why we're here to help. Who's we? Well, we're Sales Feed, brought to you by Vidyard, and we believe in sharing ideas, stories, news, and entertainment to help you be more successful, to help you sell more tomorrow. Find us on LinkedIn, YouTube, Instagram, iTunes, or wherever you get your podcasts, or head over to salesfeedmedia.com and trade your email address to get the very best of Sales Feed in your inbox every single week. Sales Feed by Vidyard, because we could all use a better life in sales. Ruben may have just walked out on the biggest opportunity of his life, but he felt good about that decision. That's because he believed in who he was. He was a fashion designer who wasn't going to let anyone, not even the cornerstone store of the fashion industry, make him change. And you know what? 6 months later, Bloomingdale's called him back, ready to sell his ties with no changes. To this day, Ruben strongly believes that had he changed his design, he would never have reached his current level of success. You see, Ruben Lifshitz isn't just a tie maker, He's also a fashion designer. Today, he's America's 97th richest man with an estimated net worth of $7 billion. And if that wasn't enough, Ruben's clothing made its way onto the silver screen. His styles were worn by movie stars like Robert Redford and Diane Keaton. Ruben even made a cameo on the hit TV sitcom Friends. And his name? Well, I left out one small detail in my story. You see, the young man named Ralph Ruben Lifshitz got tired of all that bullying as a kid and decided to officially change his name when he was 19 years old to simply Ralph Lauren. Today, Ralph Lauren is more than just a style icon and a fashion designer. He's the perfect example of a salesman who never compromised on his vision. He was even quoted as saying, "What I'm most proud of in my life is that I went into this business on my own terms. I never threw myself away." When Ralph was given the biggest opportunity in his life, he decided to stick to his guns. He decided to stay true to himself and to his product and refused to have his brand watered down by the demand of his clients. So, think about your own product or service. Do you know exactly what you're selling? Do you know what makes it so special? And most importantly, are you able to resist the temptation to say yes to anything your prospect says just to close the deal? Because it's the salesperson who can recognize the true value of what they sell without compromising who have the power to change the world. Ralph Lauren never lost sight of what made his brand special, even though he started with just rags. And that's how it all began. That's How It All Began is written by Rachel Kraft and Andrew Davis. Our editor is Sean Cleary. Our head of research is Emily Allen. Our illustrator is Kelly Kingman. And our production manager is Elizabeth Davis. Our executive producer is Tyler Lessard. That's How It All Began is a production of Monumental Shift and is distributed by SalesFeed and Vidyard. Find us on YouTube, iTunes, and wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next episode of That's How It All Began.